It's time now for World Watchers International with Mae Brussell, who for over 17 years has investigated and exposed political conspiracies worldwide. World Watchers International originates at KLRB, Carmel, California. Here's Mae.
Good evening. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. This is broadcast number 468, and it's November 23rd, 1980. When I started my research 17 years ago, I began saving articles on the assassination of John Kennedy. A few years later, in 1968, I had articles and books that began to expose the possible conspiracy in the murder of Martin Luther King. And a month after that murder, there was Robert Kennedy, and there were violences in the summer of '69 and the beginning of killing rock musicians way out of proportion to the amount that would have died even from drug or overdose. And then I began files on the Manson family and the SLA as the CIA, and the notorious Watergate story that broke from 1972 on up to the present time. And then my filing cabinets bulged with articles on mind control and the resurgence of the Nazis, the German Nazis in America and around the world, and the Klan. And I began to get drawer after drawer of files, and sometimes they cross-referenced over names like Ed Davis and Evel Younger and Ronald Reagan and Charlie Bates, Bates in the Watergate, the SLA. In London, he was in Chicago with Fred Hampton of the Black Panthers was murdered. And my files became really difficult to assimilate because of the overlapping, and I didn't want to copy them and cross-file them so many times. But now with Ronald Reagan as President of the United States, I'm taking all of the filing cabinets in the systems, and I'm reorganizing, and I'm putting all of the research into alphabetical order instead of separating it according to topic, because now the people in Reagan's cabinet, the people elected to the Senate, in the states, and in the national, and the House of Representatives, and the Defense Department and the cabinets all overlap. You can't separate Nixon's cabinet, Caspar Weinberg or George Shultz. You can't separate Bechtel Organization or John Connally. And now the whole era is culminating in the ascendancy of Ronald Reagan, and therefore I am now, as I say, putting the files into alphabetical order. There was a cartoon in the paper this morning, the San Francisco Chronicle, the Examiner, by Pfeiffer, and I thought I'd mention it because you may not get his cartoons on the East Coast or up north or Midwest. A gentleman is looking at a very tough Army official, and he's saying, how could the United States tolerate such a drastic military imbalance? It's a national scandal. When did we first learn we were defenseless against the Russians? He asked the military man. Was it in 1979 with Brezhnev? And the officer says earlier. Was it in 1960 with Khrushchev? And he says earlier. Was it in 1948 with Stalin? And the officer says earlier. And the gentleman says when? And he answers 1917 with Lenin. And that, of course, is the bottom line for rearming, for the military budget that is bankrupting this nation and every other nation that is involved in making weapons systems, the imbalance of the utilities that use the world's energy that is required for this warfare state, and the greediness of accumulating the Earth's minerals and reserves in order to make war against Russia. The decision to make war was as early as 1917. It brought on the arming of Hitler and Mussolini for that purpose, and when they lost the war, we got ready for World War III. So the headlines that you read today were created in 1917, and the cartoon with just 6 drawings says it very nicely. I mentioned last week the anniversary of the assassination of John Kennedy, the 17th anniversary, and I'm going to do some more on that this evening, in fact, most of the broadcast. But I didn't talk about Jonestown. It's been 2 years since the massacre in Jonestown. People on the East Coast don't get too much news on the Jonestown story. Larry Layton is here now in San Francisco to stand trial for the murder of Congressman Leo Ryan. There was a 2-part series on ABC News this week with various people associated with Leo Ryan and accusing the State Department of negligence. Jackie Spears, who was shot at the airport down in Guyana, has continued to say there was a massive cover-up that's going on today. They showed Richard Dwyer, he's of the CIA, who was at the airport. And Jackie said when the shooting started, he fell on his back, a spread eagle, and was lying down, and she thought he was hit or killed. And when Leo Ryan and the others were dead, he got up and went away and was sped right away back to the compound in Jonestown. And they played the tape on television of Jim Jones before all the people were murdered there, the 918 that were left to die. He is saying, get Dwyer out of here, get Dwyer out of here. Now, Dwyer is going to testify with Mr. McCoy, they're from the State Department, before the House Foreign Affairs Committee next week, I believe. And I've been in touch with Mr. Joe Holsinger. He was on television. He's the aide to Leo Ryan, and they are still working on the story of Jonestown and why the State Department and the CIA have covered up to this day the real story behind Jonestown. The House Foreign Affairs Committee is going to have hearings. The House Intelligence Committee did and covered it up. But the Jonestown massacre is not going to be covered up any more than the John Kennedy assassination or the Robert Kennedy assassination or Martin Luther King or any of the other political murders done by the Intelligence Defense Department of the United States. Stories will come out all the time. It is my belief that Jonestown was set up for genetic experiments, for mutations, for physical experiments, and that if anybody went down there, it didn't have to be Leo Ryan, anybody else, and wanted to take these people out, provisions were made to have everybody die there. I did several tapes on cassettes for people that subscribed to this before I went back on KLRB and other radio stations, and if you want them, you can send a self-addressed envelope to me, and I'll give you a list of the tapes. I compared it to Colonial Dignidad down in Chile. That's the border of Chile and Argentina. Mr. Krause of the Washington Post wrote an article comparing Colonial Dignidad to Jonestown, the similarities, and I did 3 tapes on information from Amnesty International, Counterspy, and the Krause article on Colonial Dignidad. It's where Mengele, the angel of death from Auschwitz, habitats, and Martin Bormann, who does experimentations on Indians in Uruguay and South America, and all the top Nazis meet at Colonial Dignidad in Chile that borders on Argentina, and they have conducted medical experiments and had immunity there since World War II. But many of the Nazis were down there before World War II. A woman from Amnesty International is going to be with me this week. She's from Berlin, and she was with Mr. Joe Holsinger up north, and she brought up the question in terms of Colonial Dignidad. Do you know what that is? She asked Mr. Holsinger, and he said, yes, I have this information, and he produced the information that he got at my home on what I believe were the medical experiments in Jonestown and the mind control experiments, but particularly the possibility of genetic experiments down there. And he gave her the printed sheets from my tape cassettes on Colonial Dignidad, and she couldn't believe that anyone in the United States had made the connection of the Nazi experimentations in South America to Jonestown in Guyana. So I will be meeting with that woman this week, and then she'll go back to Germany, and we'll hopefully find out some more about the Layton family that sent money down to Jonestown. Larry Layton's mother was having money sent from Germany to help support Jim Jones right from the very beginning. So this story is national and it's international, and this particular person did work with Amnesty International and said, yes, indeed, it is linked to Guyana. The Colonial Dignidad is linked to Guyana. There were articles in the paper this week, 3 different papers, maybe your papers. Lure of Profit Stirs the Science of Genetics, Los Angeles Times. On top it says Academic Concern. This is big business. Another article in the Examiner, Associated Press this week, expert calls for an end to the gene splicing rules. And the San Jose Mercury guideline for gene splicing someday may be unnecessary. So if they can't do it in secret down these places, they're going to do it out in the open, and it will be big bucks. There also was an article in February this last year that I want to talk about at length on another broadcast called Psychosurgery Resurgent, and it has to do with the case of Leonard Kiley. I've mentioned him before, an engineer who invented the Polaroid land camera, who was the subject of experimentation. And the important thing is that the doctors that were playing around with his brains and totally destroyed his mind worked in a hospital in Boston and also moved out to UCLA at the Psychiatric Institute set up by Ronald Reagan. And these people have direct links to Jonestown and to the Los Angeles Police Department and the people that worked with Jim Jones. I mentioned last week that James Earl Ray, the man charged with assassinating Reverend Martin Luther King, has asked for a complete pardon. He says that he will tell who paid to get him involved in the Martin Luther King assassination. He didn't say he killed Martin Luther King, but he said he will tell if he gets a complete pardon. The San Jose Mercury had an article this past week backing up that article, saying that Ray has written to the prison board chairman and that the chairman said that he's asked for a full and complete pardon and that they will meet him eyeball to eyeball and hear his petition. James Earl Ray has filled out a 30 to 32-page document on the killing of Martin Luther King, and the prison chief said that Ray's petition is so complicated that the prison board would have to take it under advisement unless he presented some startling thing like a witness who said, "I killed him." So they're not very sure that James Earl Ray killed Reverend Martin Luther King down in Tennessee, and they're going to meet him eyeball to eyeball to discuss the large document that James Earl Ray has written up, 30 pages, supporting the idea that he should get a full and complete pardon. Now on to the John Kennedy assassination, because there is an article I want to go over with you at length. It was in last Sunday's paper, but it was too new for me to absorb before I went on the air. The movie Dallas, the TV movie Dallas, always had an interesting title for me because Dallas is associated with that coup d'etat in the United States that I spoke about last week and the murder of the President of the United States, John Kennedy. The evening Dallas performance where the female mistress kills the main star of Dallas was the eve of the killing of President John Kennedy, and the day that the movie went to England was the anniversary of the death of John Kennedy. And JR and JFK aren't very far removed, and I believe that the timing of this is not just a coincidence. There are a lot of reasons to believe it not only was a great diversionary, but it was an electronic game to get our minds off of something timed for specifically November 21st and 22nd as a great diversionary to a terrible American tragedy. Speaking of the assassination of John Kennedy, last week I talked about a book called The Man, having to do with Greek Nazi fascism that the CIA put in. But this week, one of my subscribers, Becky, sent me the review of a book called DORA by John Michael. And this John Michael is a man 70 years old who was at the prison camp, the labor camp called DORA, where the V-2 rockets were built. And now that he's 70 years old, he's speaking up. He said, "I'm over 70 and I've been silent a long time, and suddenly I want to speak of the future. I have the need to tell my story." And he tells how awful it was to bring into the United States and Russia the Nazi scientists and not to treat them at Nuremberg as war criminals. He talks specifically about Walter Dornberger and Wernher von Braun. Now, Walter Dornberger became the chief of aerospace, Bell Aerospace, in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, and Lee and Marina Oswald's host, Michael Payne, worked for Walter Dornberger. There were Nazis all around Lee Harvey Oswald from the time he came home from the Soviet Union, and probably while he was in the service and in the Soviet Union. But Walter Dornberger's position at Bell Aerospace is interesting because Ruth Paine was the person that transported Marina Oswald to New Orleans when Lee moved there ahead of time. She picked her up and arranged for the delivery of their child in the Dallas-Fort Worth area in Irving, Texas. Whenever Oswald traveled, the Paines stepped in and substituted and took care of Marina and housed her and took care of her needs. And it was that home where the doorbell, the police knocked on November 22nd, 1963, after John Kennedy was killed, and they wanted to come in, and Mrs. Paine said, "Come in, we've been expecting you." And she took them to the garage where a rifle was supposed to be under a blanket, and it wasn't there. The chain of command of evidence to the Paines is very strong in helping plant or implicate Oswald in the assassination of John Kennedy. And this book, DORA, is about the role of Walter Dornberger and Wernher von Braun. I mentioned before that Dornberger was written up in the book Project Paperclip as a man who should have been hung at Nuremberg, but he went on to be an executive for aerospace. And now this John Michael, who's 70 years old, describes life at DORA. DORA was a work camp they were moved to after Punaman was bombed by the Allies. It was underground. It was a complete tunnel, and it was a working camp for treating resistance fighters and underground fighters. It wasn't just a camp for Jews. It was people who opposed the Nazis were moved to DORA. And the guards, starting in 1945, every day meticulously killed and exterminated. They'd take 57 men a day and hung them. They put them on an electric crane in a tunnel, lifted them 12 at a time, hands behind their back, wood in their mouth, hung by the length of a wire attached to the back of their neck so they couldn't cry. And everyone working at DORA had to watch the hangings every single day. And Walter Dornberger, who arranged these hangings, and Wernher von Braun went on to become the great giants of American aerospace. And this is where they ran their caves in tunnels and mines in Germany before they became prominent and wealthy in the United States. Leonard Bernstein upset a party in New York City last night. This was in the Associated Press. A large investment of a new book on music, the New Grove Dictionary of Music and Musicians, $1,900 series of 20 volumes of music. And Leonard Bernstein got up to give a few words and give a speech. They had other prominent people there. The former British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan was there. What did Bernstein talk about? He talked about the assassination of John Kennedy. He noted that the assassination of Kennedy was that evening. It was the anniversary of his death. And Leonard Bernstein said this, in quotes, "It is one of the great traumas that ever occurred in this country. It is so great that people are not willing to confront it. We don't dare confront the implications. I think we've all agreed there was a conspiracy, and we don't want to know. It involves such a powerful high force in what we call high places. If we do know, everything might fall apart." Other people at the party got angry at Bernstein. They said that there were investors, that stockholders that had put money into the book, and they'd been working on this book for 10 years. The 20 volumes had cost approximately $8 million to get out, and they didn't appreciate the speech, but Leonard Bernstein felt compelled at this time to give such a speech. And I believe, I said when Ronald Reagan came in, there'd be more political activism in this country and more people would speak up because they're getting scared. I don't think Bernstein would have said this 2 years ago, but now he knows that's the bottom line, and we better find out who did it. Now, about the article in Parade magazine. Parade is a Sunday insert that you may or may not get. I get it from the San Jose Mercury, and it's also published in the Washington Post. And last Sunday, apropos of the Kennedy assassination, there was a section, a resume of a book by G. Robert Blakey and Richard Billings. G. Robert Blakey is the swindler, the man from the Justice Department who teaches at Brandeis, who headed the House Select Committee on Assassinations. And he's coming out with a book, A Plot to Kill the President, a challenge to the Warren Report. Blakey is absolutely an insult to people's intelligence, and I think it's very important to analyze this article with you, if it takes 2 weeks to do it, to show how desperate the establishment is now that there is a conspiracy that people are very well aware of all over the world to pin it on a particular person, specifically Fidel Castro and John Rosselli, who's dead, and not take into account all the other missing evidence or the physical evidence or the subterfuge that preceded the death or followed it. The main people involved in saying, oh, yes, now we have a conspiracy, are columnist Jack Anderson, who writes part of the article on the plot to kill the president, and G. Robert Blakey. I have warned people for years, stay very aware of Jack Anderson. When he has a story, it has a purpose, and he's so much a part of the power structure, the fascist power structure, that you have to take Anderson with a grain of salt and challenge his outright lies. But this story that he comes with is the lowest of his journalism's low, if you can believe that, and I want to analyze it with you. Before Blakey wrote his column, there is a section on the left side by Jack Anderson, and this is what he said. He said, apparently the accused assassin Lee Harvey Oswald didn't act alone. Now that's pretty good for Jack Anderson after 17 years. The truth is there's no proof that Oswald fired a weapon. He was a decoy, but Anderson now is saying, oh, Oswald didn't act alone, whereas for years he was putting us researchers down. He had a famous column that I did a whole radio broadcast on called Balderdash. The fact that somebody had suggested that organized crime, the anti-Castro Cubans, the CIA, and the FBI, Defense Department were in on the killing of John Kennedy was just so much hogwash to him. But now he's saying, apparently, the accused assassin, Oswald, didn't act alone. Then he asks, did the late John Rosselli know? Now, Jack Anderson is very safe because Rosselli had his arms and legs cut off and he was stuffed into a drum with some weights and sunk over some water in Florida. So we're never going to know what Rosselli knows. So Anderson can pin his conversations with Rosselli to the assassination because there's no Rosselli. He said, this is what Anderson said. He said, John Rosselli agreed to work for the CIA to kill Fidel Castro. This we know. If he killed Fidel Castro, the U.S. Justice Department would look over his mob arrests, and Jack Anderson said they were occasional transgressions. Rosselli was known for murder, selling narcotics, setting up prostitution, anything illegal the mob does, and extortion, blackmail, and so forth. He wasn't Mr. Kling. Anderson calls those occasional transgressions. Rosselli trusted Jack Anderson. This is what he says. He trusted me. He suggested that Santo Trafficante, who's the only alive person in the entire set of articles, besides Judith Campbell Exner, he suggested that Santo Trafficante's assassins be sent to kill Fidel Castro. Mr. Trafficante, who lives in the United States, had such a neat school for assassins that maybe the CIA, who can't do so well on their own, should use Trafficante's assassins. But, according to Jack Anderson, Trafficante's assassins were captured by Fidel Castro, and Castro turned them around and said, now that I've got you, you go kill John Kennedy for me. So the Trafficante assassins came home and went about and killed John Kennedy for Fidel Castro. And according to Jack Anderson, Castro directed the mob to kill JFK. I mean, can you stretch your imagination to believe that Castro ordered the autopsy at Bethesda Hospital or the Earl Warren to lock up the archives for 75 years or to burn Lee Harvey Oswald's Defense Department papers or to forge his name on ordering a weapon? Do you believe that Fidel Castro could even exhume or cremate that body of Lee Harvey Oswald that Earl Warren ordered cremated? The Los Angeles Times has an article this week about Marina Oswald. she doesn't know who she married, and she's not sure if that's her husband, and she doesn't think he's in the grave. Did Fidel Castro order that body cremated, or was that Earl Warren? I believe I was the first newscaster in the country to read on KLRB and on KGO and other stations the minutes of the meetings of the Warren Commission where Earl Warren ordered the cremation of a body that was not Lee Harvey Oswald's but was supposed to be his, so we wouldn't have the shock of knowing about those doubles. Jack Anderson went on to say that Rosselli had the mob recruit Lee Harvey Oswald, and now they put Lee Harvey Oswald with organized crime. 17 years of research, and with every book published on the assassinations that is available, and having gone through every page of the Warren Commission for 9 years before I ever went on the air, I never saw any link of Lee Harvey Oswald to organized crime. He was with the Defense Department agency, with DISC, the Defense Industry Security Command, with Albert Osborne on a bus going to Mexico. He was in Oaxaca, Mexico, with Division 5 of the FBI School for Assassins. He was meeting the FBI down there, and the Defense Department people, such as Max Clark, Chief of Security of Convair. He and Gally Clark, his wife was a Tsarist Russian, member of the Sherbatov family. Oswald was with those people. He was with executives of oil companies and with Michael Payne from Bell Aerospace. I didn't see any record of Lee Harvey Oswald with organized crime. So Jack Anderson, 17 years after the death and after 2 investigations, a renowned columnist with radio time on ABC, Good Morning America, almost every day, and columns all over the country, has to get to the lowest low to absolutely fabricate the truths of the Kennedy murder. Now, why would Jack Anderson put himself on the line and reach out to do this 17 years after the murder? He said the mob got Oswald because he was a sharpshooter. Oswald was never seen with a weapon after he left the Marines, and 3 months after he was in the Marines, he was sent to Biloxi, Mississippi to do electronic work, and then to the Tsugi Air Base in Japan and in Philippines where the U-2 airplanes were, and he did radio electronic work. He wasn't a marksman, and he didn't shoot. Jack Anderson said Oswald was going to be the man to kill John Kennedy, according to John Rosselli, but he never gives one incident where he knows he was recruited. And he said the mob felt that if they used Lee Harvey Oswald as their front man, nobody would associate the mob with Lee Harvey Oswald. Well, that's true because there isn't any evidence that Lee Harvey Oswald was ever with the mob or with Castro Cubans. He was with anti-Castro Cubans in New Orleans and in Dallas and Fort Worth and so forth, and in Mexico. Jack Anderson said, to be sure, John Kennedy died by the second gunman at the Grassy Knoll. To make sure he died, they put a second gunman at the Grassy Knoll. I think of the early books on the Kennedy assassination, even Mark Lane's Rush to Judgment, or Joe Jostin's Oswald, Assassin or Fall Guy, or Thomas Buchanan, Who Killed Kennedy, and Leo Savage, The Kennedy Conspiracy. All the researchers in early articles talking about a gunman at the Grassy Knoll and a suspect being photographed and the Dallas police leading him away. Were those Dallas policemen Fidel Castro's policemen when they took those suspects off the Grassy Knoll and out of the railroad cars? Jack Anderson said Oswald was arrested and had to be eliminated, so they used a little punk, a local punk, Jack Ruby. Jack Ruby worked with Richard Nixon years before with the House Security Committee. He worked with the FBI as an informer. He was a known anti-Castro Cuban who was sending arms down there for revolution against Fidel Castro, who was in touch with Jimmy Hoffa and Traficant and Carlos Marcello. Jack Anderson, at this point, in 1980, calls Jack Ruby a local punk who was to erase Oswald because Oswald was associated with the mob, and the mob used him for Fidel Castro. So at this stage in our history, Jack Anderson is trying to push this story out, which is so far from the truth that it's comical. Half hour is over now, so we'll take a break for 1 minute, and then I'm going back to excerpts of the book of G. Robert Blakey on the plot to kill the president.
This concludes the first half of World Watchers International with Mae Brussell. We will return with the second half after a brief pause.
Watchers International with Mae Brussell, and now here's Mae.
All right, this is side 2. I'm going to do sections of a book by G. Robert Blakey, The Plot to Kill the President, an Expert's Theory. I don't know I know where G. Robert Blakey's coming from. I just want to point out what he's saying because it is so repulsive and ridiculous. The excerpts from his book, I'll describe a few sentences and then analyze them for you. He says that organized crime was responsible for killing John Kennedy, that John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy were in pursuit of underworld figures, and that would supply the motive. What he leaves out is that John Kennedy also pulled away support from the Bay of Pigs and that anti-Castro Cubans wanted to kill John Kennedy. He leaves out the nuclear test ban treaty that was tying the hands of Wernher, vonBraun, and Dornberger and those Nazi war criminals, and that tied the hands of John Kennedy. He leaves out the fact that Kennedy was going to pull advisors out of Vietnam, and outside of the Berets being over there, he was going to bring home the people that were there after the 1964 election. He was stepping on toes in Dallas, New Orleans, and the entire Southwest with the oil depletion allowance. He was integrating troops into the South and trying to get civil rights bills and laws passed and put Major General Edwin Walker, a staunch Birch member linked with Nazis in Germany and the far right. He put him in a mental hospital for a few days. Robert Kennedy did. There were a lot of reasons for killing John Kennedy, not only the fact that Robert Kennedy was after the underworld figures. It is true he stepped on toes and was going to deport Rosselli or Trafficante or Carlos Marcello, and it is true that the CIA with Robert Mayu could recruit organized crime because organized crime had the modus operandi to kill John Kennedy. The Defense Department could put their patsy on an assignment as a decoy in the Texas School Depository building, and the Mafia could do the killing. The killing was done by several elements of our society, none of them liking the Kennedys. The Dallas police and the civil rights and the invasion of Cuba that he pulled back from. Organized crime knew that they could kill Kennedy for the Defense Department if the Defense Department set a patsy in the Texas School Book Depository building. Blakey mentions that rumors circulated for years that there was a connection between Joseph Kennedy and an organized crime figure, Frank Costello, that went back to early liquor business in the 30s. And after the repeal of Prohibition, Costello had helped make Kennedy wealthy, and later Kennedy had snubbed him. Yes, Frank Costello may have been mad at Joseph Kennedy, but I doubt if Costello could have controlled the Warren Commission, the lawyers who were all CIA people, J. Edgar Hoover, and Division 5 of the FBI, and the staff of the Warren Commission. I doubt very much that Mr. Costello or the whole entire hierarchy of the Justice Department would have covered that well for organized crime. Now, they go into detail about John Kennedy with Judith Campbell. Her name was Exner. She married a man, Mr. Exner, at the time of the House Select hearings. Her name came out. But they go into the background of Judith Exner, and this is the interesting part. I like to follow the chronology of years and time slots of where these people were and what was happening to them. In November of 1959, that's Kennedy ran in November of 1960, but 1 year before he was going to announce his nomination for the presidency when he was a senator, Judith Campbell was under contract to, according to Robert Blakey, 3 studios. Warner Brothers, MGM, and Universal. That would be interesting in itself, to be under contract to all three at the same time. Now, Louis Mayer, with his Ida Koverman, the secretary who had been secretary to Herbert Hoover, and the Warner Brothers were very far right-wing. The Warner Brothers hired Errol Flynn. They knew he was linked to the Nazis. They were politically right. Warner's and MGM allegedly had Judith under contract in 1959. There was a lot of subterfuge and intelligence going on in Hollywood, more than we realize it's surfacing now. Howard Hughes had bought a studio. Joe Kennedy had a studio. Richard Helms, E. Howard Hunt, rather, had been out in Hollywood working with disguise. It was a very political climate that was the nurturing of Ronald Reagan also. And in 1959, out of California, the same year that Judith Campbell was working for these studios, was the year that Vice President Richard Nixon, their boy, their man, was getting ready to run against John Kennedy in 1960. It narrowed down to those two 1 year later. November 1959, just a year before the next elections were to take place, Judith Campbell meets Frank Sinatra, who's now arranging the inaugural ball for Ronald Reagan. And she has an affair with him, and Sinatra had been a part of mob and organized crime all of his life. His career was started by them. And in 1959, she goes with Sinatra to Las Vegas, and she's attracted to John Rosselli in Las Vegas. He's part of the Chicago mob that moved in to the Desert Inn and the Stardust. Then February the 7th, this is 3 months after Miss Campbell meets Frank Sinatra, she is taken by Sinatra in Vegas to John Kennedy, the senator, and he's introduced to Judith Campbell, and that's when their relationship began. Kennedy was in the Senate. He would be running for president in November. Our elections were in November, and in February of that same year, Sinatra fixes Kennedy up with Judith Campbell. March the 7th, they meet at the Plaza Hotel in New York again. The Plaza Hotel is an interesting place because in May of that year, just March, April, May, 3 months later, Robert Mayu, who was in both the FBI and the CIA, who worked for the Howard Hughes organization, which was a cover for assassination teams and crime members. It was at the Plaza Hotel 3 months later that Robert Mayu hired John Rosselli, Sam Giancana, to combine with the Central Intelligence Agency to set up assassination teams. In exchange for the mobsters not being investigated or deported, Mayu was working for Howard Hughes, but the CIA wanted his cover to be used. So you had the CIA, the Hughes organization, and the mob all bedded and meeting together several months after the introduction of this Judith Campbell to John Kennedy. Now, Kennedy didn't have to fall for the bait. That, I admit, that was his downfall, to fall for the bait. There was a show on television this evening on Jimmy Hoffa, and what did Hoffa know about the assassination of John Kennedy, and how he was meeting in Florida with Santos Traficanta, Carlos Marcello, Robert Mayu, and that gang. And this broadcast implicated that Hoffa might have been killed for what he knew about the Kennedy assassination. But the program ended with the statement of Mr. Dan Muldew, who's written a book on the Teamsters and on Hoffa, was speaking. The program ended with a sentence: when the underworld is linked to charismatic leaders and power in Washington, the agencies like the CIA or the FBI, when the underworld is linked to power in Washington, charismatic leaders, no one is safe. So Kennedy did fall for the bait, and from March 1960 until March 1962, he was meeting with Judith Exner. Now, in 1962, he stopped seeing her. J. Edgar Hoover, who worked with Meyer Heydrich and Kaltenbrunner and Hitler's Interpol and international police, J. Edgar Hoover went to visit John Kennedy and allegedly talked about Judith Exner, the fact that While he was seeing her before she would see John Kennedy, she'd be down in Florida or with Sam Giancana or John Rosselli, or afterwards she would report back to these people. So J. Edgar Hoover, who hated the Kennedys, had all the juicy pictures and evidence he needed to blackmail Robert Kennedy to silence later and to defame John Kennedy and have a good record for 2 solid years on the bedroom expertise of Judith Campbell and John Kennedy, the woman who was going between the mob at both ends before and after John Kennedy and reporting back to them. Now, she has said, and this article mentions it, that she felt she was used by the mob, but she knew full well what she was doing. A listener sent me from back east a review or a section of a book on Hitler's Secret Service, the story of the Kitty Salon in Germany. And this book is put out by Pyramid Press in 1958, a paperback, and it talks about Heydrich, the Nazi who believed or formed the idea of the final solution for Jews in extermination camps. One of Heydrich's great expertise was the establishment of the Saloon Kitty, and that's where they had very wealthy ladies, cultivated ladies from the upper crust of German society who would sleep with the various officials and military people in Germany so that they were well photographed. And this salon has been discussed in other books also. And they would know all the habits of the men and the places they frequented and their individual sexual habits. And the purpose of these was to control political officials through blackmail by fixing them up with these high-class ladies, and probably most of the men were married and had families. Adolf Hitler and Heydrich could control these people. So Judith Campbell, working as an agent with the same people that were employed by Robert Mayo of the FBI and CIA, was going back and forth to organized crime until March 22nd, 1962. Then G. Robert Blakey said that in February the 7th, 1960, after Judith was introduced by Frank Sinatra to John Kennedy, as I say, the meetings began to escalate. But March 1960, this is 2 months later, one month later, March 28th, 1960, Frank Sinatra made another introduction. First, he introduced her in February to Kennedy in Las Vegas. Then Sinatra took Judith to Sam Giancana down at the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami Beach. Now, if my memory serves me correct, I was making notes from what Blakey wrote. I believe that the Fontainebleau Hotel in Miami was owned at that time by David Schein's family. David Schein owned the Ambassador Hotel. He still does, where Robert Kennedy was killed. But David Schein and Roy Cohn were those 2 young funkies that were used by Senator McCarthy for the red baiting and looking for communists all over the world. They were very instrumental in the rise of Richard Nixon's career, and they're important, of course, for Ronald Reagan. But in February, Sinatra introduced Judith to John Kennedy, and in March, he took her down to Miami to Sam Giancana. And she says that she was not intimate with Giancana for more than 1 year, but that she would meet him, and that while she was dating him, she was having sex with the President of the United States, and she would report back to Sam Giancana. So in February, she meets Kennedy. In March, she meets Sam Giancana. And in May, Mayu takes Giancana, John Rosselli, and sets up with the Central Intelligence Agency, just in that order, the assassination hit teams that the CIA was to set up using organized crime and the intelligence community in the United States. And I'm convinced that the reason the CIA and the FBI could use organized crime and use Jack Ruby to silence a man called Lee Harvey Oswald or his double, there's a lot of discrepancies there that I'm writing about in a book, but the point is that organized crime were the kinds of people that could use Ruby and silence the man who said, I was a patsy, I didn't kill anybody. But organized crime was working with the government steadily since World War II, but I'm talking specifically about the assassination of John Kennedy. Now, Blakey is giving the chronology, but he is not putting into his book how Robert Kennedy was to be silenced later because of the bedroom hopping of his brother. I remember in 1975 in January in Boston, there was a convention of conspiracy researchers talking about the assassination of John Kennedy, and a question was asked to me. I was one of the speakers there the very opening evening. Was asked, why doesn't Robert Kennedy or the Kennedy family do anything about opening up the investigation of the murder of Kennedy? And of course, I'm always brazen and outspoken, and my answer was because John Kennedy was so busy bed hopping and being fixed up with women that was the method by which they could silence Robert Kennedy and Ted Kennedy later to avoid what did come out anyway at the time of the Intelligence Committee. Well, Judith Campbell said that on more than one occasion, when she'd see the President of the United States, then she would go immediately and see Sam Giancana of organized crime. She admitted in her book that she may have been used by Sam Giancana right from the beginning. She says this now. And Mickey Cohn wrote in his book that Sinatra got Kennedy all the broads he could have ever used. And, of course, Bobby Baker, working for Lyndon Johnson, was fixing the Washington people up with all the broads they could ever use so that Johnson could control the House of Representatives through blackmail and little tickets of telling them how to vote. G. Robert Blakey goes on to say that John Rosselli told Jack Anderson, now he refers to Jack Anderson, that between 1967 and 1976, he was in conference with him until Rosselli died. Rosselli was in contact with Jack Anderson and told him that the mob was behind killing Kennedy, that he was involved because he was threatened to be deported if he didn't participate. And then Rosselli, according to G. Robert Blakey, got in touch with Sheffield Edwards, who later was also murdered, and Sheffield Edwards was director of the CIA Office of Security, who had planned the CIA assassination teams. And Edwards said that Rosselli was willing to help the FBI, but that he would be murdered. They wanted him to be a witness and testify against organized crime, but Rosselli was afraid he would be murdered. Incidentally, the assassination team was set up by four main people in addition to Robert Mayhew. Robert Mayhew is alive today, and so is Trafficante. Those are the two survivors of this thick network of the assassination team combined with the intelligence team. In June 1975, Sheffield Edwards died. In June of 1975, Sam Giancana died. William Harvey, from the FBI, he was in the FBI 1940 to 1947, and then the CIA, who helped supply poisons and set up the assassination team, was murdered June 17, 1976, and in August, John Rosselli was found dead. The article, the TV show on Jimmy Hoffa told how he died 1 month after Sam Giancana in 1975, and that he died because he knew about the setup of Trafficante and the CIA in the murder of John Kennedy. Now, you would think that people like G. Robert Blakey, a lawyer, a law professor, a man who was given $6 million to find out who killed John Kennedy and Martin Luther King, would not at this point in history believe that Castro ordered the mob to kill John Kennedy. Just in his own book, if you take the things he says, you can see how the CIA set this up. Well, also another motive for the CIA doing it, which was equally as great as the mob wanting to get the Kennedy brothers, was that John Kennedy hated Allen Dulles and fired him. And that was a no-no. John Foster Dulles of the State Department and Allen Dulles represented the entire work of the OSS CIA people that are in Reagan's cabinet now were the agents of Dulles. Dulles wasn't to be fired. He had total power. He worked with Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's chief of intelligence. He set up our CIA, our National Security Council, and Kennedy spoke up in that famous statement, "There's a hidden government behind my back," and fired Allen Dulles. Well, Kennedy, a young punk, he's the punk, not Jack Ruby, a young punk from Harvard who goes from a lush home of wealth, at least during maybe not his early childhood, but certainly his college or prep school years, from comfort and a home environment that was fairly secure, into the Senate and into the White House, who studied a few people and wrote a book, Profiles of Courage, when he was injured during the war. If he didn't do his homework on John Foster Dulles and Allen Dulles, he was a dead man, because there was a hidden government behind the back of John Kennedy, and they came back and killed Kennedy. The CIA that had lost their darling Allen Dulles. Replacing Allen Dulles was John Cohn, who became an executive of Bechtel Corporation, who is behind Ronald Reagan. We'll go more into the Reagan appointments in a while. John Cohn of the CIA, and Richard Helms worked for Bechtel after he left the White House, and Richard Nixon. But that's another story. We'll get into that later. The point is that John Kennedy got rid of Allen Dulles, and Allen Dulles set up Robert Mayhew and organized crime and the FBI, and it was a perfect marriage of anti-Castro Cubans and the highest level of government intelligence to kill the President of the United States. And G. Robert Blakey, at this point in history, as I say, to try to blame Fidel Castro is pathetic. And the primary witnesses in all of this, as I say, have been murdered. He goes on to tell how John Rosselli became close to Drew Pearson after he got out of prison, and Blakey says that in 1968, John Rosselli was convicted of cheating at the Friars Club in Beverly Hills, was sentenced to 5 years in the federal pen, and when he got out, he began a long association with Drew Pearson to talk about the role of the mob and CIA activities. What Blakey doesn't tell you was that when Rosselli was charged for cheating at the Friars Club in Beverly Hills, his attorney was Grant Cooper, representing the Howard Hughes Organization and Organized Crime, the attorney Grant Cooper. And in June 1968, when Senator Robert Kennedy was running against Richard Nixon and was murdered in the Ambassador Hotel owned by David Schein, Sirhan couldn't have an attorney for months because the attorney that selected for him by the powers that be was Grant Cooper, who would go from the John Rosselli case, a man involved in killing John Kennedy. His lawyer would then go on to Sirhan, who was being accused of killing Robert Kennedy. And instead of defending Sirhan, the great Grant Cooper, according to the court trials, and it's all in black and white, told the jury his client killed Robert Kennedy, not Thane Caesar, the guard from Lockheed, again linked to the Hughes organization, but John Rosselli's lawyer, Grant Cooper, was also the lawyer for Sirhan, and helped convict Sirhan, another patsy like Lee Harvey Oswald, to take the rap for the murder of Robert Kennedy. Sirhan's trial was put off. Ebel Younger, the man who prosecuted Sirhan, I mentioned last week, is part of the transition team helping Ronald Reagan, and he will go on someday to be head of the FBI or Justice of the Supreme Court. Ed Davis, who covered up the murder of Robert Kennedy and falsified and allowed the evidence to be destroyed that would prove that Thane Caesar did the fatal bullets. Ed Davis is our senator in California because of these last elections. And Frank Sinatra of this team is going on to the inaugural ball. The assassination teams are moving upward. They have never been stopped, and they are in prime time. Well, Rosselli served from 68 to 73, and then he got in touch with Jack Anderson. And in the interim, in 1969, Drew Pearson had died. Drew Pearson, I believe, also was murdered. He was a journalist who had broken a story about Ronald Reagan and a homosexual ring up in Sacramento. He broke the story about the Howard Hughes payoffs to Richard Nixon's career. Drew Pearson was a very fearless journalist who was part of the establishment but had some explosive stories that stepped on the toes of the Howard Hughes Organization, Ronald Reagan, and Richard Nixon. And in the interim, by the time Rosselli got out, Jack Anderson had inherited the files of Drew Pearson. They were, in quotes, partners, journalists. They both rented an office of Irving Davidson, the man that's been indicted in an abscam case, who introduced Jimmy Hoffa, part of the assassination team, to Clint Murchison in Texas, another part of the assassination team. And then Drew Pearson conveniently died September the 1st, 1969. Jack Ruby was dead January the 3rd, 1967. So John Rosselli could tell Jack Anderson a lot of BS because most of the primary people who would know or speak up were being killed off. And then, as I say, when Senator Church began his hearings on the Kennedy assassination, Sheffield Edwards, William Harvey, John Rosselli, and Sam Giancana and Jimmy Hoffa were all murdered. There were murders going on in the Dallas-Fort Worth area that I've done tapes on. There have been approximately 150 people linked to the Kennedy assassination, primary witnesses that were murdered. I get outraged that Jack Anderson and G. Robert Blakey are so desperate that 17 years after the assassination of John Kennedy, people in the establishment, as I say, professors at law school, established journalists, have to go out of their way to take outright lies, such as the fact that Fidel Castro used the mob to kill Kennedy to cover up the murder of the President of the United States. As Leonard Bernstein said last night, it was hardly a party to celebrate, even if they put $8 million into a 20-volume book. That wasn't the mood he was in, and he wasn't thinking about who killed J.R., and neither were those people that really care of what's going on in the world. It's a terrible commentary to get an entire nation wound up in a television series that finalizes in a murder on the eve of the death of the president, the anniversary of that death, in the city where the president was killed. And then for magazines like Parade or book publishers to put Blakey's book out is outrageous. Who was publishing the book of G. Robert Blakey? The New York Times, of course. The same New York Times that published the Warren Commission 17 years ago. The same New York Times that had an introduction of Louis Nizer saying that this is the final last word on who killed the president. It was Lee Harvey Oswald alone. Well, even Blakey and Jack Anderson are now saying that there were two gunmen. There was a gunman at the grassy knoll, that there was an arrangement to hit Kennedy, that Oswald's first bullet didn't go anywhere, the second one didn't damage him, that they had to have a close-up at the grassy knoll fence. What do they do then with the bullets and the shells found at the knoll, the witnesses that fled, the people that ran up there? How do they fit the new theory that Oswald did on the orders of Fidel Castro or worked with the mob to all the evidence we've put together for 17 years? This kind of garbage cover-up not only happened 17 years, but all of those people are in prominence and power today. And that's why this story has to come out someday. That's why Leonard Bernstein speaks up now, because he's not just an artist, he's a thinker. And any thinking person knows that we have to keep asking these questions now because time is running out. And speaking of running out, our time is out now. So this is Mae Brussell at KLRB in Carmel. You have nice holidays, Thanksgiving, and so forth. I'll be back with you next week.
This has been World Watchers International with noted conspiracy investigator Mae Brussell. This program originates from Carmel, California.